What if your posture is not limited to bones and muscles? And what if your posture is the embodiment of your traumas, your beliefs, your lived experiences, and all the ways that you learn to survive and to belong? I first came to posture work because of my own chronic pain and aches. As I transformed my posture and moved beyond aches and pains, what I found underneath it was illuminating. Not only my body was changing shape, but it also was revealing deeper narratives of trauma, beliefs, and all the ways that I learned to belong. In this video, you learn what your posture is trying to tell you through reflective exercises that allows you to dive deeper into your understanding of your posture. The most common way of looking at posture, especially in the health and fitness world, is through the lens of biomechanics. Looking at the posture and saying, oh, this is tight, this is weak. We're going to be stretching this, we're going to be activating the other one. And sometimes by doing that, you get some relief and you might even feel like your movement is improving a little bit. But so often in my work, being able to do this work for the past almost 10 years, I learned that that is oftentimes is not long lasting unless people are willing to dive deeper and understand the reason, the deeper why behind the adaptation patterns. To see this more clearly, let's look at 3 layers of postural conditioning: familial, cultural, and systemic. When we're exploring these layers, know that you can always pause the video, maybe have a journal nearby and take notes and reflect on these questions. I give you some examples of my own lived experiences, and hopefully that's going to give you a little bit more insight into yours, or how could you look at your own personal experiences. None of the things that I'm about to share with you is a way for me to blame anybody or anything, rather for me to develop a deeper understanding of the why. And in that understanding, I can create deeper postural transformation that is not only changes how I look, rather how I'm actually interacting with the world. The first one is familial. And the question that I want you to reflect on is this: who did I have to be to feel safe, loved, and accepted at home? I was born in a very young family. My mom was 16 years old when she gave birth to me, and before that she had a miscarriage and she gave birth to a stillborn child. And you can imagine how stressed she was when she was pregnant with me. And my dad was about 22 years old, responsible for a household of 7, to be able to not only provide for them, but also welcoming a new child to the world while having a sick mother. And later, when I was 4 years old, my brother was born immaturely. And you can imagine how my young parent that already had a difficult time with all the responsibilities that they were carrying, now they were responsible for this immature child. And that was when I learned that I wasn't allowed to feel, because if I were to feel my big emotions, then my parents needed to be responsible for me, but I could see that they had their hands full. And that really been ingrained in my system. So you can reflect on what is the actual story for you? What is the texture of that story that you're telling yourself or you learn to adapt? The second layer that we want to look at is cultural. And here's the question that I want you to reflect on. Who did I have to be to belong to my community or social identity? The cultural experience that really affected me has been me growing up in a setting, in a community, in a culture that men had so much power and women oftentimes would follow along. And it was patriarchy at its core, and not only women didn't have any say in their own household, they often didn't have any say in the larger setting, which makes sense. And also, my dad always tried to empower me to be like, oh, you can do whatever you want. You need to dream big. You can do this, you can do that. While what I was actually seeing is I would see a lot of smart women being trapped and never be able to live the life that they fully deserve to live. And I always held that conflict within my own system. And I always thought, I've been conditioned to believe that if I worked hard enough, I supposedly get there. But then the other narrative was I would never get there because I've seen these women, they never got there, whatever there is. So what is your narrative around cultural programmings? The third layer that we want to look at is systemic. And the question that I want you to reflect on is, who did I have to be to survive capitalism, war, colonizations, or any other dominant system? It can also be education system. When I was born, I was a post-war child. So still the country was dealing with a lot of scarcity that came as a result of war. And then also the government itself was oppressive and still is. And then I remember I have clear memories of this hypervigilant that we need to watch our back. We need to be careful because what if they find our video player in the linen closet? What if they find out we do things that are illegal? And we're constantly worried that they would knock on our door. And that hypervigilant, that feeling of something is going to happen, lived in my system strongly. And then later when I moved to the West to live the free life, as you can see, like capitalism has its own layers of pressure, even though it might give you opportunities, but then also it makes you feel like, oh, if you didn't make it, then something is wrong with you. Otherwise, the system is provided for you, right? That striving continuously stayed in my system, in accompanying that feeling of hypervigilant. So I'm curious, what is yours? It's up to you how deep you want to go into these conditioning layers. I encourage you that sit with the ones that really call you forward and they're very present and you thought about it before. It's been repeating itself in your life before. And then later, as your postural journey moves forward and you begin improving, then automatically these layers of understanding deepens even more. Now that we spent time on understanding the 3 layers of unconditioning, it's time for us to move on into understanding how we adapted to these conditionings, because every single one of us adapts differently. Let's say we can imagine 2 people, both of them experiencing bullying. One person, their adaptation is to hide away, to go inward and to feel shy and to feel like they lack confidence, they can't show up. And on the other hand, another person decide that they're not going to deal with that, so they turn into a bully. So they puff up the chest and constantly being in this overextended position and moving through life like that. Before we go further into this conversation, look at this photo and choose which of these postures do you associate with more. When it comes to postural adaptation, there are so many directions we could take this conversation. For the sake of simplicity and having a framework that is clear, that allows you to deeply reflect, I categorize postures and their adaptation to 3 main categories. The category 1 is flexion, category 2 is extension, category 3 is a mix. Extension posture often shows up in people who are always striving, pushing through, and disconnected from their inner sensations and emotions. And they carry this deep sense of fear of failure, fear of losing momentum, and oftentimes fueled with perfectionism and overachieving tendencies. And they feel a lot of pressure and fear of stopping and being weak. I certainly associated with this posture a lot. I constantly felt like I needed to push, and I had this flare-up chest pushing through life, and I felt like I never had time to actually sit with my feelings. And if we really reflect that and connect that to the soul that we already discussed, the layers of conditioning is that familiar conditioning that I learned that there was no room for me to feel. A question that I want you to reflect on is this: where do you notice yourself pushing past your limits to keep moving? And what might it feel like to pause instead? The body's story of people with this posture is, I must push through. I don't have time to feel. And if I stop, I'll collapse. When they're conditioned, they tend to be overachievers. But when they are unconditioned, they are the artist. They're meant to be a living embodiment of being and doing. Flexion posture is often known as the posture of shame. This pattern often develops as a way to shrink presence and to avoid confrontations or rejections. It reflects a deep fear of being too much and burdening others, often tied to patterns of people pleasing, fawning, and early experiences of invisibility. Here's a question that I encourage you to reflect on if you identify with this posture. Where do you notice yourself shrinking to avoid conflict or rejection? And what might it feel like to take up a little bit more space? The body's story of the flexion posture is, I must shrink to stay safe. Taking up space is dangerous. When they're conditioned, they tend to be withholders. But when they're unconditioned, they meant to be seers, deeply attuned, perceptive, and unafraid to name what others cannot. Mixed posture is the experience of needing to stay hyper-vigilant and hyper-aware of the surrounding and constantly adapting to external expectations. It carries a deep fear of not being accepted and often shifts between identities depending on who is in the room. The question that I want you to reflect on is, where do you notice yourself shifting shape to belong, and what might it feel like to stay you? The body's story of this posture is, I am holding two opposing forces and I don't know where I belong. When they're conditioned, they tend to be pleasers. When unconditioned, they're meant to be an alchemist of the world's polarities with an innate gift for understanding all sides of the story. If you've been following this far, let me know what came up for you doing these exercises. If you want to find out what is your postural archetype, make sure that you take the quiz, Discover Your Body's Story quiz down below. See you in the next video.